Would you all turn with me to the book of Esther? Tonight we are going to begin a new series where we'll be looking at the story of Esther. And if you don't know where it's at, it's in my Bible, page 435, if that's helpful. Or if you just go Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther is where we're going to be. Oh, is it? Well, there you go. That means you have the right Bible. So, just a little bit before we go right into the text, just to give you some maybe some highlight information about the book. So the author of this book, like many of the Old Testament, it's actually the author's anonymous. So we don't actually know who wrote the book of Esther, though there have been some potential possible authors, and from what I understand is the majority consensus of those who, if they have a guess, they're going to say Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, you're going to be introduced to. He's one of the key characters within the narrative of Esther's story. She's actually her cousin, who actually ends up adopting her and basically plays as her father and raises her because she actually ends up being an orphan herself. So many think that potentially because of him being around the same time period, having the personal connections, having the actual being within the events themselves, would be able to give an account of this. So many think it's potentially him. And now the setting of the book of Esther, it's actually set in Susha, which is the capital city of the Persian Empire. And this is during the reign of the king Ahasuerus. Or Ahasuerus, however you pronounce that. But an easier way, for some of you, you might be more familiar with this king, King Xerxes. Actually, the other name for Ahasuerus is Xerxes. And if you've ever seen the movie 300, right, the battle there going on, that's actually the battle based on Xerxes and the Persians going against the 300 Spartans. So if you've ever seen that movie, you're familiar with that story. I think it's the Battle of Thermopylae. Is that how you pronounce it? So this is actually that same king, and it's during his reign, which is approximately between 486 to 465 BC. So if you can kind of think around that time frame. And this is following around 100 years after the Babylonian exiled, the captivity. So Israel, they had fallen into sin and idolatry, right? And so we know Babylon, they came and they conquered and captured the Israelites, and then they were there. That's like the story of Daniel, right? So they're in that Babylonian captivity. Well, we have that there's Cyrus the Great who comes and actually ends up conquering the Babylonians with the Persian Empire. And what he does is he actually gives this decree that allows the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, where they can go and be back in the Holy Land, and they can set up the temple and build the walls again and actually have some of their independence. So that's actually what Ezra and Nehemiah are recording. So they're recording the Jews who, after the exile, are able to go back to Jerusalem. And so you're going to see things that are going on with Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, what's interesting about Esther is this is the story of the Jews who stayed in the region of where they were being held captive. So there in Ezra and Nehemiah, you have the Jews that leave, go to Jerusalem. In Esther, you have the Jews that decided to stay in the pagan regions. And so Esther is recording what happens to the Jews in this area. And so some other curious features that I just want to share with you, because the book of Esther is really interesting for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that though it's in the Bible, God is never mentioned in this book. It's the only book in all of the Bible that does not mention God or quote God or anything like that. He's never actually mentioned in the book. However, there are what many scholars refer to as coincidences, or another way is they would say like an ironic reversal that happens within the book. You'll notice there's a lot of things that just seem to happen right at the right time in the right way for things to all of a sudden just shift the story. And there's a lot of interesting things that just immediately happen within the story. And what we would refer to that as is God's providence. So what we're seeing is though his name might not show up in the book, we see the hand of God throughout the entire book. And so as you can kind of see there, so what we're seeing in the book of Esther is we're going to see the unseen God. So God is working providentially through this book, though he might not ever actually speak, or they might not record his name. One other curious feature about this book is the moral ambiguity of it. If you notice in this story, there's going to be a lot of characters, good and bad, who make a lot of different choices and decisions and actions, and the Bible doesn't really comment on whether or not it was good or bad, which is interesting, right? So you're going, because in like the story of the Kings or the Chronicles, it'll say like he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, or he did good in the eyes of the Lord. Well, in the book of Esther, we just see a lot of things happening that some of the actions, even by the main good characters, are questionable sometimes. And like I said, the Bible doesn't really comment on it. So you might notice that sometimes when people study this book and preach or teach on it, that they might actually have some different takeaways from it. And so you might even differ a little bit with me on how I see some of these things that are playing out, and we can discuss some of those. And hopefully there will be some good discussion on that. So with some of those things just being set up before we go into the book, we're going to focus on Esther chapters 1 to 2 this evening. And I'm not going to read the entire chapters for us, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of tell you the story, and then as we start to make some application from the story, we'll read some of the verses within these chapters together. So basically what happens in Esther, as I said, it starts with Ahasuerus, the king, or Xerxes. I'll probably say Xerxes more throughout the study so I don't butcher the name. But you have King Xerxes, and he's in his reign. So he's reigning over the Persian Empire, and he's in, as I said, the capital city of Susha. And what he's doing is, during his third reign, he's has this huge feast, or a huge banquet that he's set up, and it's like excessive. He's like getting all of his wealth displayed for the whole empire to see. And so it says that he's letting his power or his wealth and his majesty be displayed for all of them. And he says that he has this feast, and he brings all of the nobles, he brings the princes, the servants, anyone that's involved in his military leaders. He gets all of these prominent people to come to his feast. Now, what's interesting is not only is he displaying it to all of these rich people or the leaders of these different groups, the nobles, the princes, but it says that he has this feast, and it lasts for 180 days. Now, that is excessive. It's one thing to have a really, really big feast where you have everything, all this, you hold all the stops, right? But this one literally lasts for 180 days. Now, it doesn't say that all of these individuals were there the entire time. I would guess probably not. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be able to have a military or a nation if all of the leaders were there for, half a year. So probably what they would do is they'd circle through at different times with scheduling with the king and his representatives, and they would come and he would basically show them his kingdom, show them his palace, all of his wealth, right? All of these different things, basically just for his own glory. He was just doing it. And then it says after the 180 days of the feast, it says then, just to kind of conclude the event, then they had a 7-day feast. So really it actually ends up being 187 days of feasting, but this 7 days is actually open to all people. So that's going to be the rich and the poor. Anyone is welcome to come to the king's feast for the 7 days. And it even mentions also Queen Vashti, so this would have been the king's wife, Xerxes' wife. Queen Vashti also gives a feast around this time. So we're actually seeing 3 feasts just within chapter 1. And you'll notice feasts are actually really important in this book because there's a total of 10 feasts. And usually all of these feasts have something going on with them when it comes to shifting the narrative. So Vashti is giving a feast for the women at one point as well at the end. So after all of this partying, and now the king, he's been drinking a lot. He actually even made a decree within the feast. He says, basically, you can drink however much you want. If you don't want to drink, you don't have to. If you want to drink as much as possible, go ahead, have fun. And it says that at one point, at the end of the feast of the 187 days, it says that the king's heart was merry. And that means he was probably well off at this point. He's probably drank a decent amount. And it says at this point, he decides, you know what I'm going to do? Just the cherry on top, I'm going to bring my wife, the Queen Vashti. I'm going to get her to come out here because she is gorgeous. She's smoking hot. And I'm going to get her to put her crown on. She's going to come in front of all of these people, and they're going to see the woman that I got. And so, like I said, he's probably drunk. He's got a lot of his drunk buddies around, and they're all probably going to just, ogle her and be like, oh, yeah, she looks really, really good. Well, the Queen Vashti, she's not having it. And I wouldn't blame her, right? It seems like it's all going to be, lusting and it would have been shameful for her to come and even do that. Now, it doesn't say exactly in the text what he was going to have her do, but Surely she didn't want to be a part of it. She knew that they were probably well off, drunk, and so she decided she refuses. Well, this causes the king to be furious because as the king who's been trying to, show everybody how awesome and powerful he is, in fact, many think that this is right around the time before he goes to war with a lot of the Greeks. It seems like he was actually probably trying to gain support to go to war. So now, after he's been showing all this, and now his own wife, the queen, won't even listen to his command or his decree. And so now he's furious. So what happens is some of his eunuchs, those would have been men who were castrated for service in the palace, they give him some counsel and they say, well, you know what you should do? You should banish Vashti from being the queen. You should remove her, take her crown from her, get rid of her, and you need to send a decree to the entire empire that the men are now the masters of their homes. So think about this. So this is a personal spat between him and his wife that becomes national security issue, right? It's like, hey, all of the men are going to basically be undermined by their women if we don't make a law about this. Now, how many people's heart changes because a law just is forced like that? Yeah, the men are going to be the boss now, right? So anyway, but it says the king, he says that's a great idea. And so he makes this decree. He takes Vashti's crown. She's no longer the queen. She probably remains as one of his concubines or residing in one of his harems. But so he gets rid of her, and then he makes this command for all of the empire. So that's kind of what we see in chapter 1. Now, chapter 2, we're actually going to jump about 4 years ahead in time. So if you notice in chapter 2, near the beginning, it's going to talk about how this is going to be in the 7th year of his reign. I think it's actually around the time where we're introduced to Esther. But so in the 7th year of his reign, it says that he's been thinking about Vashti. So it's been some time that's passed. He's thinking about the decree that he made about Vashti, and it doesn't say exactly what's going on through his head, but he's probably thinking, I miss that girl. I miss that woman. I kind of regret my decision. And also, since this being the 7th year of his reign, we also know that he had already lost many of the battles to the Greeks. So he's probably really, really not feeling good. He's like, don't have my queen. We've lost some battles to the Greeks. Now I'm just not sure what to do. So now, some of his other eunuch servants, they come, and what they do is they give him some more counsel. And what they recommend is say, you know what you need to do? You need to let us go and do a search and a call for all of the young, beautiful virgins in the empire. You need to let us bring them to you. And then what you can do is you're going to be able to replace Vashti with someone who's better than her. So you're going to find a woman who's better than her that will be queen. And so what he does, he's like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. This king doesn't seem like very wise in some of the story. It's almost comedic in the way that this is being told by the author of the story, especially if it's Mordecai who's recording this. But he says, yeah, that's great. Let's send this decree out. And then at that point in chapter 2, we are introduced then to these two Jews, Mordecai and Esther. Now, Mordecai is, as I said, potentially the author, and he's the cousin of Esther. Now, Mordecai, the name means Marduk. It comes from that, which is one of the pagan deities. And so you can tell, living in a pagan area, you would see some of this kind of blending in. Likewise, Esther, who is a Jew, her Jewish name is Hadassah. Now, Hadassah, what that means is myrtle, like a myrtle tree. So if you're familiar with the myrtle tree, what it does is it has a beautiful flower that kind of does like a little starburst out of it. Which is interesting because Esther, the name Esther, which is her Persian name, Esther actually means star. So if you have Hadassah, which could mean like myrtle, which would have a beautiful star-like flower, and you have Esther, which actually means star, and also is where we know the goddess Ishtar, right? Similar to the same name there. So we see some pagan derivatives there of the name. So it says that that Esther is very beautiful. It says that she's very good to look at, and she's a Jew that's been being raised by Mordecai, her cousin, because she was an orphan. And it says at this time, it says that as the decree is being passed around the empire, it says that Esther is also taken to the palace. Now, it doesn't say who took her. It doesn't say It could potentially be some of the king's servants that maybe were going around. It could be that Mordecai maybe saw the decree and thought, oh, well, I'm going to have to take her because they're commanding it. Or it could be that Mordecai just decided, you know what, this is a potential chance to make Esther the queen. It doesn't really, like I said, it doesn't really tell us how it happens. It just says that she was taken to the palace to be a part of this process. And so as they are taken to the palace, it says, or to the region of the palace, it says that the women are given over to a eunuch named Hegai. Now, Hegai was basically responsible for these young virgins that were going to meet the king. And so what the process was here was for 12 months, so for a full year, they were going to get all of these beauty treatments. Now, I'm not sure, some women might be thinking, this sounds pretty awesome, but literally, so it says like for the first 6 months, they're going to do certain things with like ointment or oils and perfumes, and then the another 6 months, they're going to do like cosmetic work and all of these different facets. And it says after they have done a year-long beautification process, then they get one night to be with the king. And so what they do is in the evening, it says that they will send one woman to go in to be with the king. And then in the morning, what she will do after she's had her chance to please and to wow the king, it says that she then will go to a new house. So this would have been probably an additional harem, which is actually led and ran by a man named Shazgaz, which is another eunuch, presumably in the text. And it says that this was the place where the concubines would reside. So after the women would go and spend the night, their one night with the king, they would go and they would live in the house or the harem of the concubines, and they would basically live there the rest of their lives, unless the king remembered their name and said, hey, I want to see that girl again. She stuck out to me, right? So that woman pleased me, essentially. And so just imagine for a second what that would actually be like, because you weren't allowed to go and marry somebody else because you were the king's property no matter what, even if he didn't choose you to be queen. So, but these women, they were, like I said, they're brought here, they do this process, then they spend the night with the king, and now, unless he wants them back, they're literally going to live in this kind of the palace, which is somewhat nice, I guess, but basically with the other women that were also rejected in this opportunity, and basically will spend the rest of their lives there. Well, it says that after all of these things are happening, it says eventually it's Esther's turn. And as we've already seen, Esther is very beautiful. In fact, she has won over Hegai, the eunuch there of the first house. And it says that basically he did everything he could to make her have a good chance. So he basically gives her extra servants to help make her pretty, gives her advice. In fact, it says she doesn't take anything extra with her into the palace to the king, because what you could do is you could actually take whatever you wanted. You had a lot of opportunities, different things for beauty and service to the king that you could bring in with you. And so a lot of these women were bringing different things. Well, it says in the text, she didn't bring anything other than what Hegai told her specifically to bring. So she was being really smart because she knew that Hegai probably knew exactly what the king likes. And Hegai was probably also hearing, like, well, she had too much makeup on, or she smelled like this, or I didn't like that they did. So all of this information is probably being fed to Esther. And so Esther listens wisely, takes the counsel, and then goes and spends the evening or the night with the king. And then it says that the king was wowed by Esther, loved her more than all of the other women. And at this point then it says that he decides to make her the queen. So think about this orphan Jewish girl named Esther, raised by her cousin Mordecai, now is the queen of Persia, right, through this experience. And now there's this great celebration where it says that they have a feast for Esther. So here we have another feast, right, of celebration. You can just imagine what this budget is for all of these feasts that they're having. But they have this feast, and he actually starts to give out all these gifts to the community, because that would be something common. When they're celebrating, they gave gifts to people in the provinces. And he even eliminated some of the taxes that were going on through generosity of the king. And then at the end of this chapter, of chapter 2, what we find, though, is that there is a plot to kill the king, where there are two eunuchs that are upset with the king. It could be with how he's running the kingdom, maybe all the feasts. It could be to deal with Vashti. It could be we just know that they seem to be very, very upset, and they plot this plan to kill the king. Well, Mordecai, who probably has been elevated because of his relationship to Esther, it says that he was at the king's gate. So he was around the king's gate. And it says that he heard this plot, and then what Mordecai does is he goes and he lets Esther know about it. And then Esther relays the message to the king, and then what Xerxes does then is he basically gets them killed. It says that they get hung on the gallows. And from what I understand is the translation there of the gallows, it's not like a being hung like a noose. It's more like actually like a spike or like a strong, like a pole. And actually you'll see this actually later in the story about how somebody else is killed on a spike or a pole like this. But anyway, so we see that Mordecai saves the king by relaying this information, and then it's written at the very end here in the Chronicles of the Kings. So the Chronicles is talking about what the kings would have in Persia of a list of different events that happen within their history. And it doesn't say anything else about the king rewarding Mordecai or anything. And actually what you're going to see is it's going to be a providential moment or a happy coincidence later in the book where all of a sudden the king remembers this moment. So nothing happens here, but later in time, we're going to see how God works it and uses it. So that's kind of where we're going to end with chapters 1 and 2. So as we think about these chapters, there's at least 4 things that I think that we can draw from it. I'm sure we could do many more, but there's 4 things that I want to draw your attention to in these 2 chapters. And the first thing is that I think that we need to remind ourselves that pursuing the things of this world is foolishness. Being so caught up with all of the things of the world, all of these material possessions, it's really foolishness. And I just want to read for you 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever." I think that's so important for us to remember that, is that all of these things that we get so obsessed with in our world, they're passing away. It's fleeting. It's a facade to buy into it. We need to think about the things that are eternal, and those who trust and obey the Lord, keep their minds on the things of above, those are the things that will abide and last forever. Likewise in Colossians 3:2, we're commanded, it says, "Set your mind on things above and not on things on the earth." Just for a moment, if you were to think about this, and I've actually this has been on my heart about maybe even doing a sermon just on that verse alone, is if you were to take a notebook and just write on the left side the things above, things of heaven, right, on one side, and then on the next side, on the other page, the things of the earth. Now you write down all the things that you've been thinking about lately. Today. This week. All of the things. Just write them all out. Anything that you've been talking about, thinking about, doing. See which list is longer. Now go back to this verse when it says, "Set your mind on things above, not in the things on the earth." Now, I'm not saying it says don't ever care about your job or your family. I'm not trying to be extreme here. Obviously, I don't think the Apostle Paul was saying don't ever do anything on the earth. But when it comes to all of the things that you've been thinking about, striving for, pursuing, how many of them are focused on the kingdom, and how many of them are focused on yourself or the things that are passing and fleeting, right? How many of them are passing away or we're focusing on? We have to make sure that we don't buy into the love of the world or the love for riches. And how many times does Jesus warn about the love of mammon or wealth, right? We need to be careful about this. And I bring this up because as we see in chapter 1, verses 2 to 9, we see that the world is promoting this message about you need to pursue wealth, you need to pursue luxury, you need to pursue the beauty standards. But the thing is, none of this is going to satisfy. It's not going to satisfy. And I want to read this for us. So I've already kind of mentioned of how excessive it is. Well, let's just actually look at the excessiveness of it in verses 2 to 9. "In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, and the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now, listen to this. This is where it kind of describes some of it. So it says, there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered that all the officers of his household, that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. So here, as I said, we see 187 days of feasting, of all of the celebration of the abundance in wine and drinking and eating. And it even talks about how like the furniture is like gold and silver. I don't know if hopefully it's just covered with some of it, because that would be very comfortable. If it's like gold, I mean, it'd be like sliding maybe, and like it'd be hard. I don't know. It doesn't sound like a nice couch, a very comfy couch. But you have like gold and silver. It says that there's like a mosaic, and there's like jewelry, actually like jewels sparkling off the floor. All of this is made out of marble, super excessive, expensive stuff, right? Well, out of all of this, you would think that, the world is teaching us we want to be like the king. We want to have this stuff. We want to be awesome like the king. But I think what the book of Esther shows us is that it's foolish to be like the king. Because out of all of this spectacle, out of all of the wealth that he has, out of everything he's doing to try to win over the nobles and the princes and show how amazing he is, look in verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. See, look at that. 187 days of all of this wealth, all of this power. He even has a beautiful queen. One thing happens. One thing. If you have a spouse, you know how many fights probably happen occasionally, where your wife doesn't do what you want her to do it sometimes, right? It happens. One thing like that happens, and it literally ruins everything for her. That is what it's like to put all of your hope in the things of the world. When you put your hope or your identity in wealth or luxury or beauty or relationships, you find that they do not satisfy you. It's never going to satisfy you. You're going to find yourself getting angry, getting depressed, getting lost in all of this stuff. And you recognize, and I even mentioned this before, it's like whenever you keep pursuing wealth and riches, it's like drinking, seawater. Right? You think that it's refreshing you, but really it's just making you more and more thirsty, and eventually it ends up killing you. It doesn't ever actually hydrate you. It's the same thing with these things that are happening in the world. And I think it's so interesting because I think our culture that we live in, we reside in, it loves the same things that the Persians loved. See, I think this story is really relevant for us. Just like the king and what people are being impressed by, we see in our world today people loving wealth, power, pleasure, comfort, and control. Just recently we had the Oscars. I'm not sure if anyone cares or watches that now, but I know a lot of people do. And if you just know the Oscars, you even know anything about it, like the red carpet, and like they take all the pictures, and like they're like, this person wore this best, and that's because our media and our world is obsessed with all of these things. We care about who or what they did at this, who won it, right? We have a lot of this spectacle in our world that we get so obsessed with it. And I think it's important that, as I said, we have to recognize that these things, though our culture and though the Persian culture are calling us to it, or wanting us to live a life pursuing these things, we need to always remind ourselves that only Christ can truly satisfy and complete us. Psalm 23:1, I know many of us probably know, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." This is reminding that when we have Christ, He is someone that actually can meet our needs. He can truly satisfy us, where the world cannot. Likewise, we have Colossians 2:9 and 10. It says, "For in Him," that is Christ, "dwells all the fullness of God, of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in Him, who is the head of all principality and power." So this is once again affirming Christ being truly God is the source of completeness, of wholeness, can satisfy all of your deepest desires. You were actually created to know Him. That's why you were made, to worship, to experience, to love, and be in a relationship with Christ. In fact, I've talked about this many times recently of the word peace or shalom. It actually, that calling for Jews to say to one another, it actually has complete and total wholeness. That's what they mean by peace. And this is what Jesus would regularly say that he came to do, is usher in peace with his kingdom, give us completeness and wholeness. So the things of the world, it's foolish to seek after. It's not going to make you whole. It's not going to satisfy you. But Christ can and will. So that's the first thing. The next thing that I think we see from the first couple chapters is a reminder that we must avoid compromising and conforming to culture. As we just finished the Romans series, in Romans 12, verse 2, it says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." This is that call to renew our minds, right? To not be conformed, not to go with the culture, not to buy into the world's lies, right? Like what we just saw. Don't follow the foolish pursuits of the world or buy into the materialistic things. We can't compromise and we can't conform. Well, why do I bring this up? Well, this might be where there might be a little bit of controversy and maybe people see it slightly different. If so, in grace, we can maybe discuss and disagree maybe. But if you notice in this in chapter 2, Esther is told on 2 different occasions to conceal her Jewishness. In verse 10 and verse 20, we see that Mordecai, well, in verse 10, she's warned, and then 20, it reminds us that she was warned. Mordecai tells her, don't let people know that you're a Jew, or that you're related to the Jews, that you worship Yahweh. Basically, conceal it, right? Which I think is really, really interesting. Now, some might not think that seems to be problematic, but for me, the way that I read this is I think that this is compromise here, where she, as a Jewish individual, a girl who was called to be a holy nation, set apart, distinct, separate from the pagan nation, it says that she, as she goes to be around all of these pagan individuals, it says that she kept it secret, so no one would know. And now for a Jew, like should be for a Christian as well, to be a Jew and for people not to know is actually really, really hard. It's harder than you may think, because there are what we probably are familiar with, the kosher dietary laws for Jews. So for a Jew to eat, there would be so many stipulations that they couldn't eat or drink certain things, right? Think of the book of Daniel, right? In Daniel, let's see where it is, 1:8. This is where Daniel, being in Babylonian captivity, which is very similar to the Persian situation, Daniel 1:8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So Daniel specifically had to request not to eat certain things, not to drink certain things, because a lot of it was either sacrificed or offered to their pagan gods. And for many things, really even for Jews to sit and dine with Gentiles would have been making them become unclean or defiled. And so in Daniel, we actually see him specifically request it, but it seems to imply that Esther doesn't mention it at all. And she lived there for a year with all of the other women and with the eunuch, and there's no one that finds out for a full year that she's a Jew. That means she would have had to be tempted, or I don't know, like I said, I don't know how she would have got around not breaking kosher. And then at the end, when she becomes queen, it says that the king has a huge feast. Well, if the king's having a huge feast, they probably would have promoted their deities in these feasts. And it doesn't seem like anyone was the wiser, because the king doesn't find out way later that she's a Jew. But it seems that she probably broke the Mosaic law, which in Leviticus 11, it specifically says, you can't do these things. Like, it's not the New Testament. We're not the New Covenant here. So it seems like she broke kosher. But then we also see some things that, like I said, maybe you disagree with me on this. But as I remember the story, before I studied this, I had a different view on some of these issues. But in verses 14 to 16, it also appears to me that she's committing adultery in this section. In Exodus 20:14, one of the 10 Commandments, we know, thou shalt not commit adultery. That would have been obviously binding for the Jew. But in verses 14 to 16 of chapter 2, it gives you the description of what's happening for the women, right? The women, they're basically soaking themselves in these oils, these perfumes, and they're making themselves smell really good and look really, really good. And it says, and it's for one night with the king. They're going to spend the night with the king, And then it says in the morning, you know where they go? They don't go back to the house with the virgins. It says they go to the other house with Shazgaz, who's responsible for the concubines, which would have been like sex servants, sex slaves. And so it says that the women, after they would spend the night, they would then go there. And then it seems to imply that Esther did the exact same thing as all of the other women. Now, it doesn't. I'll be very open. It doesn't say, and she slept with King Xerxes. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say she committed adultery. It just kind of seems to give the narrative without really explaining good or bad what's happening here. But as I said, I don't think this king, who doesn't seem to be very godly, doesn't seem to be very moral, I don't think he's wanting these women to come into his chambers or to hang out with him all night just to talk, or just to get to know them and see, so where do you work? Right? I just personally don't see that. I think it's an immoral, lustful act that's going on here, and these women are sadly having to partake in it, and it seems that Esther is also one of them. And then finally, in verse 17, we know that she becomes the queen. Now, she's a Jew marrying a pagan, and this is in direct violation of Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 to 4, where Jews are actually forbidden to intermarry. So we actually see here that she's breaking another commandment potentially by marrying someone that is not a Jew. So actually in Ezra, we know that Ezra actually freaks out when he finds out about all the Jews that were in Babylonian captivity that had intermarried. And he basically says, you guys need to divorce. He actually tells all of the Jews to divorce these Gentiles because they had broken God's commandment. Like I said, this is different than the commandments for the church. This is Israel and what their law was. But these are a lot of different concerns that I think where you see some moral ambiguity of the choices made by Esther. And I do understand she's in a place where there's the king who rules and he does what he wants, and the culture is so different there where basically people just obeyed the king. However, once again, I think that's why we have a reminder as God's people, we can't compromise or go, even if the culture all buys into it. And I think actually we have a good example of this with Daniel. Now, as I said, Daniel, once again, was before Esther, with Babylonian captivity, with the kings there being immoral. But with Daniel, we know in Daniel's friends, right, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in chapter 3, when the golden image comes up and everybody else bows, they don't. They refuse because they're Jewish, because they worship Yahweh. And then in chapter 6, it says you can't pray to your gods. Daniel disobeys in chapter 6. He prays to Yahweh, and then he's thrown in the lion's den. So we see that there are examples around the same time period where you can compromise, but we see that I think the good example of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is we aren't to compromise. We're regularly called to honor the Lord, and I think that though Esther, I think, is in a horrible situation, I think many of us potentially would have maybe caved into the pressure as well. I think Christians do it sometimes, a lot of the time. So I think that, we can't blame her too much, but I still think that compromise is compromise here. And I think that also is a warning for us in this chapter. I think the next thing that we see is that God is providentially working and present even when he seems invisible. And I think this is actually the key for the entire book. As I mentioned, God's name is not mentioned in this book. But I think that we know that he is providentially working and present. He is present and active within the entire book, though he might seem invisible. And I think this is encouraging for us, because there's going to be times where God seems invisible in our lives. He seems invisible, or maybe that he abandoned us in our culture, right? But I think even when we see Esther dealing with all of the things that are happening in Persia, in this kingdom, I know that we can see God working in the midst of it. Nothing is going to thwart God's promises to his people. That's actually, I think, one of the big messages of this whole book, is that whenever it seems like God has abandoned us, when we see that sin is rampant in the culture, we still know that God will keep his promise, that he is with his people, he is watching over them, and he is protecting them. And I think you see this with God protecting and using Esther and Mordecai. He uses them as unlikely instruments. As I said, you have two Jews in a pagan culture with a big empire, and now she is going to be used to actually do something later in the book, which some of you are familiar with. And you'll see how God uses her and protects her through the entire process. And I think this is an encouraging thing for us as we think about Acts 17, where we're told that God, he knows all of our appointed places and our times, and he has a plan for us, and he's not far from any one of us. We see him being like that for Esther and Mordecai. And I think even though they are imperfect, God is able to use them even in their brokenness, even in their fractured state, their compromising state, I think that even though we are imperfect, God can still use us in the process. Your failures do not frustrate the purposes of God. This actually reminds me of the movie Jesus Revolution, if some of you have seen it. That was one of the main messages of the story, is that you see these godly people that are imperfect. They're broken. They don't always do the right thing, always say the right thing. And there's one quote that the wife says to the husband at the end, the pastor, Pastor Chuck, at the end. He says, he's like getting upset, saying, well, Lonnie's gone. What am I going to do? And she says, don't be so, pride or arrogant to think that your failures can hinder the work of God. And I think that's a powerful message for us, is that our failures, our brokenness, our compromise at times will never compromise God's purposes and His plans and His promise. He is able to accomplish amazing things through imperfect people all of the time. Think about Abraham telling Sarah to lie, that she is his sister. Abraham tells her, hey, say you're my sister, you're not my wife. God can still work through Abraham. Think about Samson. Samson compromised multiple times, but still able to accomplish his purposes through him as a judge. Think about David, right? One of the best kings, but also we know did one of the worst things you can possibly do by killing another innocent man, right? Or even Peter, as one of the disciples, denying Christ 3 times. We see God regularly can work through broken people. So if you're that person that maybe has a past or there's something you're struggling with, give it to Christ and recognize He can still do amazing, wonderful things through you. The final thing I want to draw from the text is, I think in this we actually see the supremacy of Christ. It's weird because God's not mentioned, Jesus isn't mentioned in here, but remember, all of Scripture is teaching us about who Jesus is. And I think as we think about this story, and if you think about in chapter 2, verses 12 to 14, about how the king dealt with the women, and you think just how gross and how abusive that is, how they have to spend a year preparing just to spend this one night with this stupid, drunk, lustful king. And he's going to say, and you have to please me. You know what I think I see from this? I think this is a message of what works-based salvation looks like. Do, and then if you do everything you possibly can, you might be accepted. But I think that's the exact opposite of what we saw in the book of Romans when we see the gospel message. See, Jesus is the exact opposite of this king. See, Jesus, I think, is a true king and a wonderful, loving husband. Romans 5, 6-8, it says this, for when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's what the gospel is. It's not, you get really, really beautiful for me, and then I'll choose if I want to accept you, if you can please me enough. It's, I love you, and I'm coming to save you and make you beautiful. In fact, we see one other text, Ephesians 5:25-27. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for her, that He might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of the water by the word, that He might present her to Himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. See, that's what Jesus does. As our King and as our husband, He comes to save us. He loves us. He makes us beautiful with the washing of His word. He's not like the King Xerxes that basically is saying, I'm going to reject you no matter how hard you try, right? We see that Christ is so much better as our King, and He is a great, good husband. And in fact, as we see Him inviting these people to a feast, we're also, I think, reminded of the promise of the gospel too. Jesus invites His bride to a feast, and it's going to be greater than anything that this world can offer. So no matter how extravagant His feast was, we know Christ's feast is going to be better. And I'm going to close with this reading of the feast, and then we'll take any comments or questions. Isaiah 25, 6-8. And in this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of choice pieces, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of well-refined wines on the lees. And He will destroy on this mountain the surface of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and rebuke of His people He will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So we see this is a feast promised to his bride. And it says that death itself, the covering, the veil of death, will be eliminated. So this feast is a feast that will last forever. And we don't ever have to worry about it ending. It's always a celebration that's going to be with our King and our husband, Jesus Christ, for the church forever.